The first thing you need to know about any card game is how to win. In Yu-Gi-Oh, your deck is 40 to 60 cards, and if your deck ever reaches 0 and you have to draw a card and can't, then you lose the duel. Additionally, both players start with 8,000 life points. This life total is interacted with throughout the game, and if your life points ever reach 0, you automatically lose the duel. Also, rarely some cards will have effects which instantly win you the duel, like getting all 5 pieces of Exodia in your hand. These are called instant win effects, and will detail how to instantly win the game with their effects on the cards. These are not common at all, and you'll rarely actually see people pull these win conditions off in competitive duels. The most common way to win is to reduce your opponent's life points to 0 using a combination of your monsters attacking your opponent's life points directly. When you're starting your turn, you draw 5 cards. At the start of each of your turns, you get to draw 1 additional time. And this happens during the draw phase, which exists on a point of other phases. You have the draw phase, the standby phase, the main phase, battle phase, the main phase 2, and then the end phase. And these are all the phases you'll be seeing pretty much every turn throughout a duel. To go over the phases in more detail, the draw phase is just where you draw a card. So, if you draw a card, you immediately just draw before anything happens, because neither you nor your opponent can do anything before you draw a card. So it's always the first thing that happens when you start a turn. However, there are sometimes effects which happen in place of the draw, like how Flame Tiger can replace your draw in order to special summon itself from the graveyard. However, after you draw a card, your opponent is free to use all kinds of different quick effects which can be used during any phase, which we'll go over later. But because they can use things after you draw, you have to declare that you're leaving the draw phase and entering the standby phase next. Generally, this is just by saying standby phase, and your opponent can tell you to wait before you move on. The standby phase is just what happens after the draw phase and before your main phase 1. By game mechanics, nothing really happens here. The standby phase basically exists for card effects to have their costs paid, because there are a lot of costs that happen and effects that happen during the standby phase, like paying the cost of Mirror Wall to stay on the field. Even though nothing typically happens during the standby phase, you still have to declare that you're entering the standby phase in paper Yu-Gi-Oh, just in case your opponent wants to do something during the phase. Then you enter the main phase 1. This is where all the magic happens. You essentially play 90% of Yu-Gi-Oh during the main phase, and 75% of that happens during the main phase 1. During the main phase 1, you have a couple of things you can do by game mechanics, and the most important one is your 1 normal summon per turn. Let's take a little detour from main phase 1 in order to explain the types of cards in Yu-Gi-Oh. In Yu-Gi-Oh, there are 3 types of cards: monsters, spells, and traps. Monster cards are basically cards that you put on the field and exist permanently, until some other card or effect puts them in the graveyard. Spells and traps are a lot more temporary. You can play as many spells from your hand as you can activate their effects, and traps can only be activated a turn after you set them on the field face down. However, monsters cannot be played infinitely from your hand like spells and traps. You can only play 1 monster from your hand onto the field, because it's a really permanent fixture. But there's even more rules to it. You can only play a monster that's level 4 or lower to the field, and you can tell a monster's level by the amount of stars they have in the upper right hand corner. If you want to play a higher level monster, you must tribute monsters in order to bring it up from your hand with your normal summon. A tribute is simply sending a monster from your field to the graveyard in order to immediately place the monster from your hand on the field. If a monster is level 5 or 6 specifically, you need 1 monster as a tribute and your normal summon available. If a monster is level 7 or higher, you need at least 2 monsters as tributes and your normal summon available. Sometimes monsters will have card effects which state you need even more tributes, but those aren't covered by the basic rules of the game and are technically part of the card's effect that you can just read on the card itself. So back to the main phase 1. You're allowed to perform 1 normal summon per turn, where you can then place 1 of your level 4 or lower monsters from your hand onto the field, in either face-up attack position or face-down defense position. When a monster is face down, your opponent doesn't know what the card is until something reveals it, which is usually a monster attacking into it, where it's revealed during the damage step, which is a surprisingly complicated step that we'll cover later. Normally, you want to play monsters in face-up attack position. You cannot normal summon a monster into face-up defense position, despite the fact they do this a lot in the anime the game is based on. Additionally, there are some other things you get from a monster once per turn. During the main phase, you're allowed to change the battle position of a monster, as long as it's not the turn that it was summoned. So on your first turn, if you normal summon a monster in face-up attack position, you cannot then put it into defense position. You have to wait until your next turn. Additionally, if you wish to attack with a monster, it needs to be in attack position, which is why these positions matter in the first place. Also, if your monster attacked and it's a different turn from when it was summoned, you cannot place it into defense position during the main phase too, because a monster cannot change its battle position after it has declared an attack that turn. But if you change your battle position before you attack, then it's fine. If a monster is face down and it's a different turn from when it was summoned, you can reveal it by doing something that's called a flip summon. A flip summon is simply changing a monster from face down defense position to face up attack position. You cannot flip summon a monster into face up defense position, so there's a risk to flipping up a low attack flip monster. A flip summon, despite being called a summon, does not count as your normal summon for the turn. It only counts as a summon for the effects of cards that specifically count summons, like Nibiru or Summon Limit. But for the most part, a flip summon doesn't matter, and you rarely perform them anyway in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! The main phase is also where you can activate all of your Spell Speed 1 effects. In Magic the Gathering, this is called Sorcery Speed. But let's go over the spell speeds real quick in order to explain what you can do during the main phase. In Yu-Gi-Oh! There are 3 types of game speeds, and they are simply called spell speeds 1 through 3. In Magic the Gathering, there are 2 spell speeds, and each one has their own little fancy name for them called Sorcery Speed, which is spell speed 1 in Yu-Gi-Oh!, and Instant Speed, which is spell speed 2 in Yu-Gi-Oh! So a spell speed 1 card is an effect which can only be activated during the main phase, and can only be activated at the very start of a chain. For example, if you want to play a Pot of Desires to draw 2 cards. This is a spell speed 1 card, so you can use it during your main phase, and you just play the card from your hand onto the field, and you pay its cost immediately in order to activate the card from your hand. Then you ask your opponent if they have a response. A response can only be spell speed 2 or higher, so your opponent wouldn't be able to play their Pot of Desires from their hand, for example. But they could use Jar of Greed if they had one face down already, because it's a trap card, and every single trap card is spell speed 2 or higher. All monster effects are spell speed 1 by default unless stated otherwise, which means you can only activate them on a clear game state, and not in response to anything else, which is the opposite of Magic the Gathering, funnily enough, because all of their card effects are spell speed 2 unless stated otherwise. So if you summon a Judgment Dragon to your side of the field, and you want to use its ability to destroy all the cards on the field, you have to wait until after your opponent gives you the okay from the summon. Because after you summon a monster, your opponent is allowed to react in some way to your summon with a spell speed 2 or higher effect. So for example, if you summon a Judgment Dragon and you want to destroy the field, you have to then wait for your opponent to give the okay to use its effect after the summon. So if they have a face down Raigeki break, which they use after the summon in order to destroy Judgment Dragon, it means it never gets to use its effect because it was too slow. This is why spell speeds are important, because you can outspeed spell speed 1 effects on monsters pretty easily. However, spell speed 1 effects on spells happen almost instantly and are not as easy to stop, because as soon as you activate a spell card, its effect will take place after it resolves, whereas a monster has to hit the field first and then activate its effect later. So there's an opportunity to get rid of the card before it ever gets a chance to do that, unless its effect specifically triggers on its summon. Spell speed 3 is exclusively for counter trap cards, and you cannot activate any cards or effects in response to a spell speed 3 effect, except for other spell speed 3 effects. So basically, you can only use counter trap cards in response to other counter trap cards. This is a very important distinction because there are some monsters with spell speed 2 effects which can stop your plays, and you can't stop their plays with a spell speed 3 counter trap card as there's nothing they can do to stop it, unless they have their own spell speed 3 counter trap card. Now let's go back to the main phase 1. During the main phase 1, you're able to use all of your spell speed 1 effects. So if you have a whole bunch of normal spell cards in your hand, you can just use all of them in your hand during this phase. So if your deck is full of nothing but spell cards which draw you cards, you could theoretically draw through every single card in your deck during your main phase 1, because Yu-Gi-Oh! Does not have a resource system to stop you from just using every spell card in your hand. This is why most spell cards which draw you cards are really bad, or have really harsh restrictions on them. However, trap cards, which draw you cards, are, funnily enough, just not as valuable. Because while you can play as many traps from your hand on your turn as you like, just like spell cards, trap cards have a rule where they cannot be activated the turn they are set. So if you have a full hand of Jar of Greeds, which only draw you 1 card, you can't actually use any of them until you pass your turn. So for example, you set 5 Jar of Greeds, which normally you can't do because you can only play 3 copies of a card in your deck, but we'll just ignore that for now. Then that is your whole turn because you have no other cards in your hand. So you have nothing left to do but just pass turn to your opponent. Then after your opponent draws a card during the draw phase, you do have the opportunity to use all 5 of your Jar of Greats, because you can activate trap cards pretty much whenever you want during any phase. So you'll draw 5 cards during your opponent's draw phase with the effect of Jar of Greats, but you can't use them until your next turn because you can't play cards in your hand during your opponent's turn. And your opponent can just reduce your life points to 0 in one turn pretty easily on an empty board, so those new 5 cards you drew are basically worthless. And this is why trap cards, which draw cards, almost have no restrictions on them, or very little restrictions, and almost never see any competitive play, because just having to wait one turn to use them is just too slow in Modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, as Modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is over in about 3 turns. During the main phase, you're also able to perform an extra deck summon, whether that be a fusion summon, link summon, synchro summon, XYZ summon, or a pendulum summon. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has a lot of different extra deck summoning methods, and all of them have to be done during the main phase 1, and rarely do you do them outside of the main phase without some kind of extra card effect. Now, there is another type of summon called the special summon, which is generally performed during the main phase 1 as well. A special summon is unlimited. You can perform as many special summons during your turn as possible. The only limitation is the amount of cards you have in your hand to perform those special summons. So theoretically, if every single card in your deck had the effect, you could special summon this card from your hand and draw a card. You could special summon every single card from your deck in one turn, as long as you had the space on your field, because you are limited to 5 normal monster zones. So for example, say you have a card like Cyber Dragon, which has the effect where you can special summon it from your hand if only your opponent controls a monster, which means your opponent has to have at least 1 monster and you have 0. You would be able to bring this card out from your hand in face-up attack position or face-up defense position, but because of the rules of Cyber Dragon's own effect, you would not be able to bring out a second one from your hand because you no longer meet its conditions. This is basically how they restrict special summons, because it's so powerful. Either you need to meet very specific conditions for them to come out, or they have a hard once per turn on that fact, so you can't bring out multiples. So because Cyber Dragon has the condition where you need to control no monsters, if you bring out a Cyber Dragon from your hand, then you can't bring out another one because you no longer meet the conditions. But if your opponent destroys your Cyber Dragon and you have another one in hand, then you can bring it out immediately. And the rules for special summon a monster to the field are very different from a normal summon, in that they ignore levels. So even though Cyber Dragon is level 5, you don't have to tribute a monster to bring it out. And they ignore the face-down defense position rule, where a special summon monster can only be in face-up attack position or face-up defense position, because you can't hide the effects of a special summon monster. And the only way to special summon monsters face down is with a card effect that specifically says it special summons a monster face down. Extra deck monsters have the same rule because extra deck monsters can only be special summoned. Additionally, summons count as spell speed 1, so Cyber Dragon would only be able to special summon itself from your hand during your main phase, because this is the only phase where you can use spell speed 1 effects that have no other conditions. However, there is a card like YUGIOH, which can special summon itself from your hand, but only during the battle phase. But because it comes out during the battle phase, it specifies that its special summon is a quick effect, which means spell speed 2, but on a monster. Every single trap card is technically spell speed 2 as well, but they don't call themselves quick effects because this is generally only denoted with monsters and spell cards that aren't typically spell speed 1. Technically, quick effect is a key term for spell speed 2. And that goes over pretty much everything you can do during your main phase. Now we can move on to the battle phase. You must declare that you're entering the battle phase in case your opponent wants to do anything before you change phases. If your opponent does perform some kind of quick effect, you're allowed to stay in the main phase instead of proceeding to the battle phase. But you have to state that you're entering the battle phase again when you decide to change phases. During the battle phase, all of your monsters who are in face-up attack position get 1 free attack that they can then use to attack either a monster or your opponent's life points directly. And this is the phase that basically determines who wins the game most of the time. Something like 90% of games are won during the battle phase, so it's a very important phase technically, but the real game is already won before the battle phase even begins in most cases. Attacking your opponent's life points directly just means you subtract the attack of your monster from your opponent's life points. So if you have a Cyber Dragon that attacks directly, for example, subtracting 2100 points from your opponent's 8000 life point total, their new life points will be 5900. Now, if your opponent has any monsters, you're not allowed to attack your opponent's life points directly. You can only attack directly if they have no monsters on their side of their field, or if you have a monster with an effect that says you can attack directly, which is pretty rare. In order to attack a monster, you select the monster that you wish to attack with, and then select its attack target on your opponent's side of the field. You can target any of your opponent's monsters, whether it be a face-up attack position or face-down defense position monster. This is called declaring an attack. Your opponent can't do anything in response unless they have some kind of quick effect, so you then proceed to damage calculation. If your monster has higher attack than your opponent's monster, then their monster is destroyed by that battle. Additionally, your opponent will take life point damage equal to the difference between your monster's attack and your opponent's monster's attack. So if your Cyber Dragon monster attacks a monster with 1000 attack, then your opponent takes 1100 points of damage to their life points. If you attack a defense position monster, then you apply your attack versus their defense points. If your attack is higher than their defense, the monster is destroyed. However, your opponent takes 0 points of damage to the life points because defense position monsters protect your life points from damage. This is why there's so many rules about summoning monsters in defense position, because having monsters in defense position is pretty valuable because it protects your life points. If the monster you're attacking was face down, you're not allowed to look at the monster until after you've committed to the attack. Once you've committed to the attack, the face down monster is then flipped face up, and then you get to determine the outcome of the battle, where if your attack is higher than their defense, the monster is destroyed. Now, what happens if your opponent's values are higher than yours? Say you attack into a monster that's a higher attack than your monster. Well, then the opposite happens, and your monster is destroyed, and you take damage to your life points equal to the difference. Additionally, if you attack into a defense monster and their defense is higher than your attack, your monster is safe and not destroyed, but you still take life point damage, which is another benefit of monsters in defense position, where not only does the controller of the defense position monster take no life point damage, but there's a chance they can deal life point damage to their opponent if their defense is high enough. Despite all the advantages of defense position monsters, you rarely summon monsters with high defense, ironically enough. Once one of your monsters attacks, you can then choose a new monster to attack. And if your opponent now has no monsters on their side of the field, you can choose to attack directly with any monsters that haven't attacked yet. And you can attack in any order of monsters you want, and they all attack individually by themselves. Whereas, for example, in Magic the Gathering, all of your monsters have to attack at once. Or in Pokemon, you only get one attack per turn. So because you get to choose each monster who attacks and what they attack, and also what order they attack in, the battle phase has a little bit of thought that goes into it, and how to properly dismantle your opponent's monsters with your lower attack monsters, so that your higher attack monsters can get in for direct damage in order to lower your opponent's life points more closer to 0. Then, after all of your monsters have attacked and the battle phase is over, you can proceed to the main phase 2, or skip straight to your end phase. Just a note, if you're the player going first, you cannot enter the battle phase, and you can only enter the main phase 2 if you've entered your battle phase. So there are some cards and effects which only take place during the main phase 2, which are completely unusable during the very first turn of the duel, since it's impossible to enter the battle phase during the first turn of the game. If you're going second, then you can use them during your first turn, just not the very first turn of the game. Because the person who goes first has such an overwhelming advantage, despite the fact they can't enter the battle phase, the person going second is allowed to draw a card on their first turn. So they start the duel with 6 cards in their opening hand instead of 5 like the person going first, who I might add does not draw a card on their first turn in case that wasn't specified. So when you're leaving the battle phase, there's actually something called the end of battle phase step, where some cards and effects only activate during this part of the battle phase, like evenly matched for example, and you cannot go back into the battle phase after cards like these have resolved. You must then proceed to the main phase 2, which is a huge difference from the main phase, where you can keep doing the main phase after effects have been activated when you were about to leave. If you commit to leaving the battle phase and it's now the end phase of the battle phase, you cannot go back to the battle phase to do something if something else happens. This almost never comes up, but it is technically a specific ruling to the battle phase, where there is a start of the battle phase, and then the end of the battle phase. Then, after your battle phase is done and your opponent has let you move on to the main phase 2, you can do everything you've done in the main phase 1 here as well. However, everything is shared between the 2 phases. So if you've already performed your 1 normal summon for the turn, you do not get an extra normal summon in the main phase 2. But if you didn't use your normal summon yet, you are free to do your normal summon here at the main phase 2 instead. You can also activate cards and effects at spell speed 1, summon monsters that require spell speed 1 like Cyber Dragon, and whatever else you can do in the main phase 1, with the exception of changing the battle position of your monsters who have been summoned on a different turn if they've declared an attack. So if your entire board declared an attack and were summoned on your last turn, you cannot change your entire board to defense position, unless one of those monsters did not attack, in which case you can individually change the ones who did not attack to defense position if you wish. The main phase 2 is pretty important because one of the most valuable things you can do during the main phase 2 is place trap cards on the field and get ready for the next turn. Because there are actually a lot of effects that happen during the battle phase which might destroy your board, or get rid of other pieces on your board. Basically, your back row with your spells and traps are not safe during the battle phase, so it's best to just set them during the main phase 2 instead of the main phase 1, and this is standard smart practice. You can generally tell someone is a new player if they set their trap cards during the main phase 1 instead of the main phase 2. Additionally, there are some cards and effects you can activate during the battle phase in order to protect your monsters, like My Body as a Shield, which you might want to have in your hand so that it's usable during the battle phase. But then you might want to set them during the main phase 2 so they're usable during your opponent's turn. Because you can't activate spell cards from your hand during your opponent's turn. So if it's a quick play spell, which is specifically a spell speed 2 spell card, in order to use it during your opponent's turn, you have to set it on the field so that it's live during your opponent's turn, in which case it basically has the rules of trap cards, where you can't use it until the next turn. So since My Body as a Shield protects monsters from getting destroyed in response to destruction effects, you can hold onto it in your hand during the battle phase just in case your opponent uses something like Mirror Force, which would destroy all of your attack position monsters, in which case you can save them with your My Body as a Shield. But if they decide to not use a card effect like that, then you can set your My Body as a Shield to the main phase 2 to be used during your opponent's turn if they decide to destroy your monsters with something like Negate, which is a card which destroys all your monsters. So quick play spell cards ideally are very powerful, which is why they rarely print good effects on quick plays, because they don't want the card type to be that powerful. We'll go over the specific types of cards later on. After the main phase 2, you then proceed to the end phase, which normally is just a phase used in order to resolve a whole bunch of effects and abilities that only last until the end phase. However, there are some archetypes which have pretty much all of their triggers happen during the end phase, and then they perform their full combo during this phase. But that's pretty rare, and for most duels this just means the end of your turn, which is different from your end phase. The end of your turn happens after the end phase, which is a distinction that matters for effects like Effect Veiler, which negates a monster's effects until the end of the turn and not the end phase. So if a monster has an effect that only activates in the end phase, its effect is still negated until the end of the turn. You can't really trigger any cards or effects during the end of the turn, which is why it's not called a phase. Then you pass over to your opponent, and as long as they're going second, they're allowed to draw a card and then proceed to all of their phases to play the game. Next, let's go over all of the extra deck types of summons. Currently, there are about 5 of them, and each one of them has different rules for how you go about them. First up, let's go over some general rules about the extra deck. The extra deck is a stack of 15 or less cards, which is separate from your normal main deck. The cards in the extra deck are available to use at any time that you meet the conditions to bring them out into the field, in which case they act like any other normal monsters, where they go to the graveyard. If they're destroyed, they get banished if a monster banishes them, but if a card returns them to the hand, they instead get sent back to the extra deck. Or if a card will return it to the deck, they go back to your extra deck instead of the main deck. Also, a monster from the extra deck must be summoned properly before you can bring it back. What this means is, even if you use an effect like Cyberstein, which can cheat a fusion monster out of the extra deck, and then that fusion monster goes to the graveyard, you cannot use something like Monster Reborn to bring it back from the graveyard to the field, because it wasn't summoned properly first. However, if the card is summoned properly by its own conditions, then you can bring it back unless the card states otherwise, which most of them do not. So you can't do something like use extra Foolish Burial Goods in order to send a card from your extra deck to the graveyard in order to bring it out with a Monster Reborn, because you have to summon it to the field properly first before you can bring it back from the graveyard with something like Monster Reborn. Now let's go over each of the types of extra deck monsters. The first we have are fusion monsters. Fusion monsters are like cooking a recipe. Each fusion monster will list on the card itself the recipe necessary in order to bring it out. Additionally, you need a fusion spell card in order to bake the recipe that allows you to bring out the monster. So, for example, let's take a look at the Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon. This fusion monster requires 3 Blue Eyes White Dragons as its materials. The card doesn't also list anything else in its text, and that's because the rules of the game tell you how to bring it out. So, if you have 3 Blue Eyes White Dragons and a fusion spell card, you can use that fusion spell card to then use those 3 Blue Eyes White Dragons in order to bring out the Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon from your extra deck to the field. The default fusion spell card is called Polymerization, which allows you to perform a fusion summon, which is just a fancy name for a special summon, but very specific in the fact that if you perform a fusion summon, that means it was summoned properly and can be brought back later. So, Polymerization will allow you to perform a fusion summon, and in order to do so, you need to have the correct materials listed on that fusion monster in your hand or on the field. For a fusion summon, you're allowed to use monsters that are face down on the field. They do not need to be face up. So as long as you have 3 cards which have their name listed as Blue Eyes White Dragon, or even have their name changed to be Blue Eyes White Dragon, like maybe Elemental Hero Prisma, which has the effect to change its name to Blue Eyes White Dragon, you would then send those 3 cards with the current name Blue Eyes White Dragon from your hand or field to the graveyard. Then you would bring out the Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon from your extra deck to any of the main monster zones, or to one of the 2 extra monster zones. Let's quickly go over what the extra monster zones are. These are 2 zones that are on the field, which can only ever have monsters from the extra deck summoned to them. And I'm pretty sure it's impossible to put a main deck monster into the extra monster zones under any circumstances. However, once you claim one of the 2 extra monster zones, you cannot use the other one. So you have to pick if you want the left or right one if it's available. And if it's not, then you have to pick the other one instead. A fusion monster can go into either the extra monster zone or any of the main monster zones. And this is a benefit of fusion monsters, because this is not the case for all the other extra deck monster types. Some of them can only go into the extra monster zone or to other zones based on other circumstances, which we'll talk about later. But generally, you don't want to waste the extra monster zone on a fusion monster. So you put it into one of your main monster zones. And there you have it. You just performed a fusion summon. However, this used a lot of materials to bring out a monster with no effect. And generally, fusion monsters need to be ridiculously powerful in order to be worth bringing out. Like, for example, Guardian Chimera. This is a fusion monster whose requirements are any combination of 3 monsters from your hand or field. However, based on where the monsters are from, you then get an effect after it's summoned, where it can destroy a number of cards on the field equal to the amount of monsters on the field that you used, and also draw a number of cards equal to the number of monsters used from your hand. So, if you use 1 monster in the field and 2 cards in your hand, you get to draw 2 cards and destroy 1. Or if you use 2 monsters on the field and 1 in your hand, you get to destroy 2 cards and draw 1. It also has premium stats for how generic its materials are, and has bonus protection, where if you specifically have Polymerization in your graveyard, it cannot be targeted by card effects, which is really good protection. Guardian Chimera is worth being brought out with Polymerization because it gains immediate advantage and a good body on the field, whereas Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon isn't really worth being brought out with Polymerization because you get nothing but a big beat stick with no protection, and it requires incredibly specific materials, which Guardian Chimera does not. However, that's where the other kinds of fusion spell cards come in. Pretty much every archetype which goes into fusion monsters has its own specific spell card, and for Blue Eyes, they have Ultimate Fusion, which allows you to perform a fusion summon of a Blue Eyes fusion monster using materials from your hand, field, or graveyard, where you shuffle the materials into your deck instead of sending them to the graveyard, since you can't send cards in the graveyard back to the graveyard. And then you bring out the fusion monster. And then additionally, if you used any monsters from your field, you can destroy a number of face-up cards your opponent controls equal to the amount. So if you had 3 Blue Eyes White Dragons in the grave, you basically can shuffle them all back into your deck to bring out the Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, which is way more worth it in terms of card advantage. But because fusion monsters basically require a fusion spell to be brought out, they are generally either ridiculously weak, or made ridiculously overpowered in order to overcompensate for the inherent downside. However, there is one other upside to fusion monsters that the other extra deck types do not have, and that's the fact that sometimes fusion monsters can have alternative summoning conditions, which do not require a fusion spell card at all. But these alternative summoning conditions can sometimes be even better than what the other types of extra deck summons allow. For example, we have Thunder Dragon Colossus. This is an incredibly powerful fusion monster, whose requirements are Thunder Dragon plus any Thunder monster. However, it has an alternative summoning condition where you can instead bring it out by simply tributing any Thunder effect non-fusion monster you control during the turn that you activated a Thunder monster effect in your hand. So if you use something like Nemesis Corridor, which is a Thunder monster which activates in hand to special summon itself from your hand, that fulfills the entire condition of Thunder Dragon Colossus, and allows you to bring it out with one card from your hand. There's also some fusion monsters which have alternative summon conditions that can be paid from the graveyard. Like for example, ABC Dragon Buster has an alternative summon condition where you can banish its materials from your field or graveyard to bring it out. And in fact, it says you do not use polymerization. And because it can bring itself out from only monsters in your grave, this makes it infinitely easier to bring out than pretty much every other extra deck type of monster, because it just encourages you to get those cards into the graveyard as soon as possible to get a free powerful monster on the field. And because of how strong fusion monsters can be in this way, there were only like 3 other fusion monsters that can be brought out with this method. And nearly all of them have seen competitive play because of how powerful this is. So fusion monsters are simultaneously some of the weakest extra deck types and some of the most potentially broken extra deck types, because they can basically have any kind of alternative summon condition printed on them they want, which can sometimes make them easier to be brought out than other types of extra deck monsters that we're going to go over later. Next up, let's go over Synchro Monsters. These are an extra deck type with a white card border and do not need a special spell card to be brought out. Instead, they need a special type of monster, which is a subtype called Tuner. When it comes to a monster and their types, pretty much every monster has one type, whether it be Spellcaster, Warrior, Beast, etc, etc. They almost never have additional types, unless it's a subtype, which is a largely legacy mechanic that's no longer used, except when it comes to tuners specifically. And all this means is that they have tuner listed next to their type. The card will not tell you what tuner means, and you just have to know the rules of how tuners work. So, in order to perform a synchro summon, just like a fusion monster, it will list what requirements are needed in order to bring it out. And pretty much all of them will just say one tuner monster plus one or more non-tuner monsters. So, for example, say we have Gaia the Force of Earth. It needs one tuner plus one or more non-tuner monsters to be brought out. But what does this mean? When it comes to fusions, they give you way more specific details on what materials are required. But Synchro Monsters just say tuners and non-tuners. Well, thankfully, it's pretty simple. All you have to do is add up the levels of the monsters. So, you need any tuner monster whose level plus the levels of the non-tuner monsters is equal to exactly the level of the Synchro Monster you want to bring out. So if you have a level 3 tuner monster and a level 3 non-tuner monster, you can perform a synchro summon with 2 of them to bring out Gaia, since it's level 6, and 3 plus 3 equals 6. But if you have a level 3 tuner monster and a level 4 non-tuner, you can't use them to bring out Gaia because their levels equal 7. You are not allowed to go over the number or under the number in any way. It has to be specific. But you can use multiple monsters to hit this threshold. So if you have a level 3 tuner and a level 2 non-tuner plus a level 1 non-tuner, you can use those 3 monsters to go into Gaia because their levels equal 6 when added up. And just an extra side note, pretty much every monster in the game with a level is a non-tuner. The way to tell if a monster is a tuner or a non-tuner is simply if it says tuner in its subtype. And if it doesn't, then it's a non-tuner. Fusion monsters can also be tuners and non-tuners because they technically have levels. So you can use a fusion monster as part of a synchro summon. In fact, there are some fusion monsters that are also tuners because they were designed specifically to go into synchro summons with. So synchro monsters are kind of difficult to use because you need to have a tuner, and there are only a limited amount of tuners in the game total. So technically, if there was only one tuner monster in the game, it would be required for every single synchro monster ever, because you can't perform a synchro summon without a tuner monster. And synchro monsters, because they're kind of hard to bring out, since they require specifically a different subtype of monster to even be used and exact math, are some of the strongest types of extra deck monsters in the game on average. If your deck is capable of playing a good tuner monster, you usually try to fit 1 or 2 in just so you have access to some of the most powerful synchro monsters. In fact, synchro monsters were so historically strong that they have the largest amount of them which were eroded to change their effects to be less powerful. There is no other card type which has had more erratas on them than synchro monsters to nerf them. Additionally, because tuner monsters are so valuable for synchros, tuner monsters on a whole generally have less powerful effects than regular monsters, because of their ability to be used for synchro monsters. So something like Glow Up Bulb, for example, which is a level 1 tuner monster that can special summon itself from the graveyard, when compared to something like Treeborn Frog, which is a level 1 regular monster that can special summon itself from the graveyard. Glow Up Bulb is so powerful, it's been banned for years, and Treeborn Frog currently doesn't see any competitive play. despite the fact that Treeborn Frog brings itself out of the graveyard for free every turn, and Glow-a-Bulb only brings itself out of the graveyard a single time, as its effect can only be used once per duel. And because of how tuners are necessary to use synchros, a lot of decks don't use Synchro Monsters at all, unless they happen to have native tuner monsters in them already, and even then sometimes they don't play Synchro Monsters, because they can't reliably get the numbers they need for the good Synchro Monsters, which are usually level 10s. If your deck can easily go into level 10 Synchro Monsters, you're probably gonna play Synchros. But if you can only go into 9s or 11s, you probably won't because they're just not as valuable as the Synchro Monsters that have been printed at level 10. Just like Fusion Monsters, Synchro Monsters sometimes have alternative summoning editions, but rarely do they include only using monsters from the graveyard, as currently there is only one single Synchro Monster that does this, which is Blackwing Assault Dragon. Now let's go over XYZ Monsters. Just so you know, these are pronounced Xyz and not XYZ, because that's just how they said it in the anime and that's how they wanted it to sound. So, the XYZ monster is the first monster we're going to go over so far, which does not have levels. Instead, they have something called ranks, which look exactly like levels as they're little black stars instead, and they go on the left-hand side of the card instead of the right-hand side. They also have a black border, so they're very easy to tell apart from all the other monster types. The way XYZ monsters work is a lot easier than Synchros and Fusion Monsters, because despite the fact they don't have levels, they require monsters to have the same levels in order to bring them out. So for example, if we look at Gem Knight Pearl, it requires 2 level 4 monsters. What this means is if you have 2 level 4 monsters on your side of the field, you can take both of them and put them on top of each other, and then take the XYZ monster from your extra deck and place it on top of those 2 monsters into any of your main monster zones or the extra monster zone. And that's pretty much it. You don't need a special type of monster like a tuner. You can just use any 2 monsters in the game as long as they are both the exact same level. So XYZ monsters heavily favor decks which use all the exact same level for their monsters. And the higher level the monsters, the stronger the XYZ monsters, with some of the strongest effects being tied to the level 8 bracket. Another neat distinction with XYZ monsters is how they activate their effects. Since the default method for bringing out an XYZ monster gives it monsters underneath it, nearly all XYZ monsters use those monsters under them to activate their effects. Like for example, Castel the Skyblaster Musketeer. It has the effect where you detach one of its materials in order to target a face-up monster on the field and then change it to face-down defense position. This means when you bring out Castel with 2 level 4 monsters, it will have 2 materials underneath it, which will give you the ability to use this effect twice total, before it can no longer use the effect again, unless you find some way to give it more XYZ materials, which you rarely do. Additionally, it has another effect, where you can instead detach 2 of its materials in order to shuffle one other face-up card on the field back into the deck. Some XYZ monsters use materials as just limited protection, like how number 101 has the ability to detach one of its materials instead of getting destroyed. And since XYZ monsters are inherently limited by a finite amount of materials, they can generally put really powerful effects on XYZ monsters, because they know they're going to be limited. Well, in theory, that's how it would work. But in practice, even the Yu-Gi-Oh designers knew this game wouldn't last long enough for that to matter. So the effects are pretty in line with a lot of the other boss monster effects worth 2 monsters of materials. So the fact that you can't use your monster effects anymore after 2 turns usually doesn't matter because the game isn't designed for monsters to last that long anyway. XYZ monsters do have some other rules to them and general ways that they're used. Some XYZ monsters have the materials where you can use 2+ of any level for them, like in the case of Primeth Megalimburtion. This means you need to use at least 2 level 4 monsters, but you can use as many level 4 monsters as you control that you want, which is usually up to 5. Generally, you don't want to put 5 monsters under an XYZ monster because that will just prime it for being attacked or destroyed. So usually you want to use the least amount as possible, unless there's a really good reason to put more than that. In the case of Alimburtion, it gains more powerful effects based on the amount of materials it can detach. So in its case, it might be worth it just to get more than 2 monsters. And because it's really difficult to put 3 or more monsters into an XYZ monster, generally some of the strongest effects are tied to monsters that require at least 3 materials. There is also a thing called ranking up and ranking down, which technically isn't an official term, just a term used to describe common XYZ alternative summoning conditions. And one of the most common alternative summoning condition of an XYZ monster is to rank up on top of another XYZ monster. For example, number S39 Utopia Lightning is a rank 5 XYZ monster, which has the materials of 3 level 5 light monsters, which you almost never bring it out of this way because it has a much easier alternative summoning condition, where you can instead XYZ summon this card by just using a rank 4 Utopia monster you control in the field as its full material, and also transfer all of its XYZ materials to this card. So if you have number 39 Utopia on your side of the field, with its full 2 materials, you can then just rank up Utopia Lightning on top of it, giving it 3 materials. However, you could even take this a step further. There's another card called number S39 Utopia Prime, which is a rank 4 monster that requires 3 level 4 light monsters to be brought out, which again, you never do because you instead use an alternative summon condition, where you can instead XYZ summon this card on top of specifically number 39 Utopia, where you then transfer all of its materials to this card, just like with Utopia Lightning. However, Utopia Prime specifically requires number 39 Utopia, whereas Utopia Lightning can just use any Utopia monster that's rank 4, which Utopia Prime is. So you can use Utopia Prime to go on top of the regular Utopia, giving it 3 materials. Then you can bring out Utopia Lightning on top of Utopia Prime, giving it 4 materials. And since Utopia Lightning requires you to detach 2 materials to use its effect, this is generally how you want to bring it out, so you can use its effect at least twice. And that's the basics of alternative summon conditions when it comes to XYZ monsters. Nearly all of them work exactly like this, where they just rank up on top of other monsters that meet its alternative summon condition, and then gain all the materials of the XYZ monsters underneath it. Sometimes the alternative summoning condition is just a regular non-XYZ monster, but a vast majority of the time it's another XYZ monster they rank up on top of. And in fact, there are sometimes even spell cards called rank up spell cards, which allow you to do this with just other types of monsters that don't have alternative summon conditions. And it's because of these spell cards that we get the name of rank up, even though it's not technically called rank up, it's just called an XYZ monster's alternative summoning condition. Now, before we move on from XYZ monsters, we should probably note that because XYZ monsters technically do not have levels, they are straight up immune to cards which affect monsters with levels. For example, something like a Gravity Bind, which makes it so all level 4 or higher monsters cannot attack. XYZ monsters are just immune to this card because they don't have levels. Also, XYZ monsters can't be used for synchro summons because they don't have levels, and synchro monsters require monsters with levels to be brought out. Additionally, when monsters are detached from XYZ materials to the graveyard to activate effects, they are not treated as being sent from the field to the graveyard. So, for example, a card like Sangan, which activates its effect when it's sent from the field to the graveyard, does not trigger because cards under an XYZ monster are not counted as being on the field. They're counted as being under the XYZ monster who is on the field, but technically they exist in a subspace which ignores a lot of rules. Because also, if a card is detached from an XYZ material as a cost, it will go to the graveyard even if a floodgate is in place, which banishes all monsters that would go to the grave, unless it's detached as an effect, which is a difference we'll go over when we talk about colons and semicolons, some of the most important distinctions on card effects. Now let's go over Pendulum Monsters. These are technically main deck monsters, but they have special rules that if they're destroyed on the field or would be sent from the field to the graveyard in some way, they instead go to the extra deck face up. So they're like half main deck monsters, half extra deck monsters. Additionally, Pendulum Monsters themselves are half spells and half monsters, which means they have 2 different effects depending on which one you're going to be playing it as. You can either set it to the left or rightmost spell and trap card zone as a continuous spell card, or you can summon it like a normal monster to the field. Each Pendulum monster has a scale from 0 to 13, and this is necessary for something called a Pendulum Summon, which interacts with levels. So, if you have a monster with a pendulum scale of 3 and a monster with a pendulum scale of 5, then you can do something called a Pendulum Summon, which allows you to special summon any number of monsters from your hand, or that are face up in your extra deck, to your monster zones that have levels between those scales. So, in the case of 3 and 5, you can only bring out level 4 monsters. Or, if your scales were 0 and 13, you can bring out levels 1 to 12 monsters, which is all of the types of monsters in the game basically. And there are absolutely scales of 0 and 13, so this is technically possible. Generally, scales don't go above 8 without some kind of limitation though. And all Pendulum Monsters have the numbers on both sides of their scales, so it doesn't matter if they're in the left or right side, just as long as they're 2 different numbers with at least 1 level in between them, so you can actually bring out cards between their numbers. So if, for example, you have a pendulum scale of 4 and 5, you can't pendulum summon any monsters because there's no monsters between levels 4 and 5. Also, there are technically rules in place for a monster to have a different scale on its left and right side. It's just currently in the game, every single pendulum monster has the exact same numbers on both sides, and there isn't really a way to change it at the current moment. But in the future, they might introduce mechanics which change the pendulum scales on the left and right, so currently that's just not the case. Now, how do you get a pendulum summon? Well, it's actually a basic game mechanic that is unlocked once you have your scales, and it works exactly like a normal summon, where you just get one pendulum summon for free every turn, but only one, and you can only use it as spell speed 1 and only during your main phases. There are cards which allow you to perform additional pendulum summons, but those are very rare and generally are not played and will also tell you in the card text that it does so. So if you're playing a pendulum deck, you generally play around that one pendulum summon you get per turn. Additionally, there are some extra rules for pendulum monsters specifically, which are brought out with pendulum summoning. If a pendulum monster is pendulum summoned from your hand, it can go into any of the main monster zones. However, you can bring out as many of them from your hand as you have zones available, and as long as their levels and restrictions allow them to be summoned from the hand, i.e. having a level in between the pendulum scales. However, if your pendulum monsters face up in the extra deck, you can only bring out your pendulum monster with your pendulum summon to the extra monster zone, or to a zone that a link monster is pointing to in your main monster zones. So, if you don't play any link monsters, you can basically only bring out one of your pendulum monsters that's face up in your extra deck. And just a reminder, a pendulum monster only goes face up in your extra deck if it would be sent to the graveyard from face up on the field. So, if you use a pendulum monster for a fusion summon, synchro summon as a tribute, or if it gets destroyed, it will go face up into your extra deck instead of the graveyard, as long as it was on the field. But if a pendulum monster is detached as an XYZ material, it goes to the graveyard like normal, because XYZ materials are not counted as being on the field. Also, if a pendulum monster gets banished, it just gets banished like normal, which means removed from the game. Or if it gets returned to the deck, it just gets returned to the deck. And if it gets bounced, it goes back to the hand, just like any normal monster would. Additionally, if there's an effect in place which sends all monsters on the field somewhere else, like Shen Shen for example, which banishes all cards on the field which would be sent to the graveyard, it also applies to pendulum monsters, because they need to have the ability to be sent from the field to the graveyard in order to go face up in the extra deck. If they're banished instead of going to the graveyard, then they are also banished instead of going to the extra deck face up. Now, because pendulum monsters go to the extra deck and can be used again on your next turn, there's a lot of restrictions on pendulum monsters which are also tuners, because this would mean you can bring the tuner back every turn to go into synchro summons on every turn for a lot easier than any other kinds of tuners, which is why more than half of the pendulum tuner monsters have effects where they just kind of banish themselves after being brought out a single time from the extra deck. Now let's go over link monsters, the final extra deck method. Link monsters, theoretically, are the easiest types of extra deck monsters to go into because they don't require levels, tuners, scales, or fusion spell cards. They just require a number of monsters on the field. Like for example, Beat Caught from the Underworld can be link summoned with any 2 monsters. This means they can be any level, any types of monsters, and even tokens. And the fact that link monsters don't care about the specifics of the monsters being used, this ridiculously opened up the viability of tokens when they were released, because link monsters care more about getting a whole bunch of cards on the field than they do about the quality of the cards that are on the field, like every other extra deck method prior. So they also have a lot of restrictions to them. Link monsters can only be summoned to the extra monster zone, so they don't get a choice to pick the other zones like fusion, synchros, or XYZ monsters do. Basically, link monsters and pendulums are the only ones who are restricted to the extra monster zone when brought out from the extra deck. Additionally, link monsters have arrows on them which point to very specific zones on the field. And by default, all link monsters can be summoned to a zone that a link monster is pointing to instead of the extra monster zone. Same goes for pendulum monsters. So technically, if you have link arrows on all 5 of your main monster zones, you can pendulum summon 5 pendulum monsters from your extra deck to your main monster zones, although setting that up is very difficult. There is also additional mechanics that come up based on how link monsters are pointing to things. If a link monster is pointing at another monster, then it's considered linked with that monster. Gameplay wise, this means absolutely nothing. But there are some cards and effects which only interact with linked monsters, and sometimes link monsters will grant effects to monsters they are linked with. If two link monsters are pointing at each other, meaning their arrows are touching, this is called a co-link. And since it's really difficult to co-link, generally there's really good effects tied to this mechanic, although it is very rare and almost never comes up, because there's only 23 cards in the game total that even mention co-link as a mechanic. Next, there's something called the extra link. This is when monsters are co-linked from one extra monster zone all the way through the monster zones and then ending on the other extra monster zone. Normally, you can only use one of the extra monster zones, except if an extra link is possible. But since it usually takes up 4 link monsters in order to set up an extra link, this is something you will rarely see. But it did used to happen pretty often when link monsters were first released, and there were a lot of really broken link monsters that existed that allowed this to happen, which are all pretty much banned now. And because of this extra link mechanic, that means there is absolutely 0 link to monsters in the game with upwards pointing diagonal arrows, because this would allow you to extra link with only 3 cards. One from the extra monster zone pointing diagonally to the middle main monster zone, and then having that middle monster zone pointing diagonally up to the other extra monster zone. So the 2 upward diagonal pointing arrows is basically like the forbidden link placement, and it's unlikely they'll ever print one in the game. In fact, there are some Link 3 monsters which have these 2 forbidden arrow placements, but all of them without exception have an effect which prevents you from using those zones to summon monsters to, specifically to prevent a 3-card extra link. You have to go all the way to a Link 5 monster before you finally get one with these 2 forbidden link arrows where it doesn't have restrictions. And because you need at least 5 monsters to go into a Link 5, it's not that big of a deal if you use a 3 monster extra link in this way, because of how hard it is to get to a Link 5 monster in the first place. And finally, there's link climbing. So basically, link monsters will sometimes have a requirement on them that says it requires 2+ monsters as their materials. This is because the amount of monsters necessary for its link summon is equal to its link rating, and its link rating will be tied to how many link arrows it has. So, for example, Gaia Saber is a Link 3 monster that requires 2+ monsters as its materials. This means you need to use 3 monsters in order to bring it out. However, it says 2+, which means you could potentially bring it out with less than 3 monsters. And the way to do this is with other Link monsters and their Link ratings. So, a Link 2 monster will count as 2 materials towards a Link monster summon. So, if you have a Beat Cop of the Underworld out already, and you have one other just regular monster, then you can use the Link 2 Beat Cop as 2 materials towards the Link summon, and then the one monster as the other one in order to fulfill the rest of the requirement. However, if the Link monster goes over the amount, then you can only use it as 1 material like normal. So if you want to bring out Gaia Saber and you have a Traffic Ghost out, which is a Link 3 monster, you can't use it as the full material because it's already 3 links worth. So it would only count as 1 monster, and you would still need 2 others, or 1 other Link 2 monster. I know it sounds a little confusing, but basically, you can only link climb with monsters with link ratings lower than the monster you're trying to bring out. So if you want to bring out a Link 5, for example, you could do that with a Link 3 and a Link 2 monster as its full materials, assuming it allowed you to do that. Technically, a high-level Link monster can just say 1+ materials, and you could use a monster with the same Link rating to bring out another monster with the exact same Link rating. And there are some monsters in the game that do that, and there's some spells that allow you to do that as well. One of the only ones that can do that on your own Link 4 monster is called World Sea Dragon's Atlantis, which is unique in that it requires 1+ effect monsters as its materials, which means if you have a Link 4 monster on board, you can use it as its full material since it doesn't require 2+, like pretty much every other Link monster in the game. Although this is extremely rare, and you can think of Zealantis as an exception rather than the rule. So that's basically how Link monsters work. They're restricted to the extra monster zone or zones that other Link monsters are pointing to. So if you want to bring out a whole bunch of Link monsters, you have to make sure the first one you bring out has a downward pointing arrow in some way, so that you can continue to your main monster zones. So, playing with a whole bunch of Link monsters really requires you to keep your zone placement very strict and serious. And the placement of your zones matters a lot when it comes to Link monsters, which is why you have to track which zones your monsters are in so heavily in Yu-Gi-Oh!, where it's not that big of a deal in other card games. But because Link monsters are so generous in what types of cards you can use to bring them out, You'll see them most commonly out of all other extra deck types, and they usually have the simplest and least powerful effects out of all the extra deck types, simply because they're just so much easier to bring out. Now that we know the basics of how to play and the basics of the extra deck monsters, let's go over the actual game mat. We talked about this a lot so far, and it's pretty intuitive how it works. You have 5 main monster zones and 5 spell and trap card zones. The left and rightmost spell and trap card zones are also the pendulum zones, and you can place your pendulum monsters as pendulums into these zones. So if you block them with your other spells and traps, then you can't use them. There is also a field zone, which you can only place a field spell card into, which is just a different type of spell card. The extra monster zone, which we just explained pretty heavily with link monsters, the extra deck, which we also just explained, and then the main deck and the graveyard. The graveyard is just where everything goes after it's been used. If the monster is destroyed, it goes to the graveyard. If something is discarded from your hand, it goes to the graveyard, etc, etc. And finally, there's banishment, which is what happens if a monster is removed from play. This is generally the better way to get rid of a card on the field, because if it's banished, it is much harder to interact with or get any benefits from it. Because there are a lot of cards in the game which have effects that activate from the graveyard, whereas there are infinitely less cards that activate when banished, but there are some as well. Now let's go over monster cards. If a monster card has an effect, it will say that it's an effect monster next to its type. If it's a tuner, it will say that next to these two, since that's its subtype. Most cards do not have a subtype though. They only have one type, and then detail if it's an effect monster or some kind of extra deck monster, where a link monster will say that it's a link monster next to its type, and that if it's an effect monster, same with fusion, synchros, X's, or pendulums. In the top right hand corner, we have the attribute. There are only 6 attributes in the game, plus a 7th special attribute that is only used by one archetype of monsters. Attributes only really matter if a card says it interacts with it. Otherwise, they don't really have any gameplay mechanics, like in Pokemon where you can deal extra damage versus other people's different types of attributes. Same with cards' monster types. It gives them no other special gameplay benefits, and is only there to be distinguished by other cards and their effects. At the bottom is the monster's attack and defense. Attack points are only applied while in attack mode and defense for only defense mode, unless they have an effect which interacts with them in different ways. When it comes to the attack of a monster, it's generally determined by its level. There's no hard-cut rule on how much attack points a monster can have for its level, and more of just something that Konami just generally designs towards. Monsters that are level 4 or lower generally have under 2000 attack. Monsters that are level 5 and 6 generally have 2000 to 2500 attack. And monsters that are level 7 and higher generally have under 3000 attack but more than 2500. Additionally, the number values get even weirder when they get into the specifics of the level 4 or lower monsters. Because level 4 or lower monsters can be summoned without tributes from your hand, they've kind of leaned into a design space of having specific values that they don't like to go over. Level 4 monsters do not go over 2000 attack without some kind of negative side effect, which means 1900 attack is the maximum attack a level 4 effect monster can have before it starts gaining detriments. For level 3 monsters, this threshold is 1700 attack, which means a level 3 monster won't go above 1600 attack before it starts gaining a detriment. For level 2 monsters, this threshold is 1400 attack. So 1300 and below is what they generally go into before gaining detriments, and in fact, the vast majority of level 2 monsters have 1000 or less attack. And for level 1 monsters, the threshold is only 500. But this one's a little bit more loose. Generally, level 1 monsters are at around or under 500 attack points, and they rarely go above it, even if they don't really gain any detriments for going above it. Extra deck monsters, they kinda go in similar territories with their attack point values based on levels of monsters used for their summon. For level 4 Synchro Monsters, because they require at least 2 monsters of materials to go into them, they generally go above the 2000 threshold without downsides, but not by much. For level 3 Synchro Monsters, they kind of follow the same thresholds. Same with the level 2s and 1s. For level 5 Synchro Monsters, they still follow the theme of not going above 2500, but there was an exception for level 6 Synchro Monsters, where one of them was at 2800 attack for its attack, and was considered too overpowered at this attack threshold that it was banned for a long time, and then was given a change to summon requirement to make it harder to bring out, to justify having an attack stat that was over 2500 for a level 6 monster. And funny enough, level 7 Synchro Monsters don't go up to 3000 attack. It's not until you hit the level 8 and higher Synchro Monsters that they get to the 3000 attack threshold. Currently, there is only one level 7 Synchro Monster with 3000 attack, and it's a relatively newer Synchro Monster. When it comes to XYZ Monsters and their attacks, they kind of follow the same values as Synchro Monsters. Rank 4 monsters, ironically, are locked at 2600 attack and below, and rarely go above 2600 without some kind of detriment. Like Crazy Box, for example, which has 3000 attack for a rank 4 monster, with only generic requirements, meaning any 2 level 4 monsters without restrictions. And it has the baseline ability where it just cannot attack, to make up for having more than 2600 attack. Anyways, enough about attack power values, let's go over spells and traps. There are 6 different types of spell cards. Normal spell cards are all spell speed 1 and can only be activated from your hand during your main phase. Because they're so slow and restrictive, they usually have some of the most powerful effects. Equip spells are a type of spell card that can only be equipped to a monster in order to exist on the field. One of the most common types of equip spells are ones that are equipped to your monsters to increase their stats. Equip cards will go to the graveyard if the monster they're equipped to is also destroyed, or if the equipped monster is flipped face down, or leaves the field temporarily. Because equip cards can be destroyed so easily, as they are vulnerable to both back row and monster destruction, they're generally some of the weakest types of cards in the game. But because they're so inherently weak, they sometimes print incredibly powerful effects on them to see if they can get away with it. Because you can equip an equip spell card to a monster from the graveyard to bring it out, which has historically been very good. And you can equip your opponent's monsters with equip cards, which can sometimes be used in order to take control of your opponent's monsters, which has historically also been very good as well. However, outside of equip cards that steal your opponent's monsters, or equip ones to the graveyard to bring them out, they're generally not very good for normal decks that don't revolve around specifically equip cards. Field spells are a type of spell card that can only be placed into the field zone, and you can only control one field at a time. But if you want to activate a new field spell, you can just put it on top of your old one, which will send your old one to the graveyard, which is something you can't do for your other types of spells and traps. Your opponent can also have a field spell, in which case both yours and your opponent's will exist on the field at the same time. Although this did not used to be the case, they changed the rules to allow both players to have their own field spell out at the same time when they decided to make field spells better. Field spells affect the entire field, meaning sometimes they have effects that you and your opponent are allowed to use. Although most modern field spells only work one-sided, and only allow their controller to use its effects. Quick play spell cards are basically like trap cards. You're able to set them and use them during your opponent's turn whenever you want, and you can also use them from your hand during any of your phases instead of just the main phases. Because they're so fast, generally they have much weaker effects on them in order to compensate. Like for example, you'll never see a quick play spell which can destroy all of your opponent's monsters. But you will see a lot of normal spell cards which do that, because it's a lot slower and easier to play around. Ritual spell cards are a type of spell card that can only be used to bring out ritual monsters. These are main deck monsters with blue backgrounds, not to be confused with the blue background of the Link monsters, which require you to use a ritual spell card in order to bring them out from your hand by fulfilling the conditions on that ritual spell card, which is usually to tribute monsters from your hand or field, whose total levels equal or exceed the level of the ritual monster. Because this whole mechanic is so clunky, modern ritual spell cards have incredibly powerful effects tied to them, and sometimes allow you to ritual summon monsters from the graveyard or even your deck as well. Continuous spell cards are a type of spell card that exist permanently on the field, similar to field spell cards, except you can have multiple continuous spell cards out, whereas you can only have a single field spell. Continuous spells basically have effects similar to field spells, where they affect all of your monsters or your other cards in some way, or have some way to generate advantage every turn. Like Supply Squad, which allows you to draw a card every time one of your cards is destroyed. One little niche with field spells and continuous spells that you should be aware of is that when you activate a field or continuous spell from your hand, there's a window of opportunity where your opponent can destroy the card before it fully resolves. And if they do destroy it in this way, its effect will never apply, since they need to stay on the field in order for their effects to resolve. So, if you use a card like Mystical Space Typhoon in response to the activation of a field spell which would search a card on its activation, it will actually stop the search from going through. But if you use Mystical Space Typhoon on something like a normal spell card that's trying to search, it will not stop the effect because normal spells do not need to be on the field to resolve their effects, since they're set to be destroyed anyway. Additionally, monsters work differently as well. Even though monsters are also permanent cards that stay on the field, if you destroy a monster with its on-summon trigger effect, the effect will still resolve because monsters specifically do not need to be on the field to resolve their effects. This rule only applies to spell and trap card permanents like field and continuous spell and trap cards. Now let's go over trap cards. For traps, there's only 3 different distinctions for them. You have normal traps, which can be activated at any point whenever you want, as long as the conditions for its activation requirement are met. If it doesn't have an activation requirement, then you can just use it whenever you want, just as long as it's not the turn it was set face down. A continuous trap is the exact same way. You can just use it whenever you want and chain into anything you want, just as long as you have the activation requirements met. If it doesn't have an activation requirement, you can just use it whenever you want as long as it's not the first turn that it was set face down. They also follow the same rules as continuous spells and field spells, where if it's destroyed before it resolves the effect, then it will not resolve. And finally, we have the counter trap cards, which is the first unique type of card amongst all of them. These cards are spell speed 3, and every single counter trap has a trigger for when you can activate them, as in they will only ever react in response to something else. You will never see a counter trap card as a chain link 1, for example. Most counter trap cards have the effect to stop other cards, so their power is relatively strong. But most modern combo decks are able to do this without the need of counter trap cards, so you don't see them too often around. But it's not a completely dead mechanic either. So think of counter traps as like interrupts. They only exist to interrupt your opponent in some way and do a very good job at it. Another little difference between spells and traps is that if you set a spell card face down, you can use it immediately the turn you set it, but you still can't use it if it's on your opponent's turn, unless it's a quick play spell, in which case as soon as you set it, it follows the rules of a trap card, where you can no longer activate it that turn, and you have to wait until the next turn to use it. And there are some trap cards that allow you to use their effects from your hand directly, but they all specifically print in their card text the conditions required in order to do that, like how Infinite Impermanence requires you to control no cards in order to activate it from your hand. Now let's explain how chains work. Chains are how you resolve a whole bunch of effects happening at once. If someone activates a card effect, then your opponent has a chance to activate their own effect in response to it, but only if it's spell speed 2 or higher, and then you simply resolve the effect backwards. So whatever was activated first will resolve last in the chain. Say for example, you activate Pot of Desires from your hand, you will immediately pay the cost to banish the top 10 cards of your deck, and then your opponent gets a chance to respond. Say they respond with an Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, which is a monster that has an effect which can activate from the hand in order to negate the effect of a card which would draw cards. That would be Chain Link 2. Then it goes back to you and you can choose to add something else to the chain if you want, where you can then choose to activate something like Called by the Grave, which targets your opponent's Ash Blossom in the graveyard, and if it resolves, will negate its effects for the rest of the turn. And then if your opponent has nothing else to add to this, the chain will resolve backwards. So your Called by the Grave will resolve, banishing their Ash from the graveyard, and then negating all cards with its name for the rest of the turn. Then Ash Blossom's effect will try to resolve. However, it's currently being negated and the effect won't happen. And then finally, Pot of Desires will resolve and draw you 2 cards. However, if we go back to this example, and you activate Pot of Desires and then pass priority to your opponent, and they activate a counter trap card like Magic Jammer, for example, which allows them to discard 1 card from their hand to negate the effect of a spell card, then priority would pass back to you. And unless you had another counter trap card of your own, this is the end of the chain, because you can't chain anything else to a counter trap card except other counter trap cards, which means you're basically chain blocked. And even if you had something which could stop a trap card in your hand, you can't use it unless it was a counter trap card. So the chain would resolve backwards, Magic Jammer would resolve and negate the effect of the spell card it was directly activated in front of, which would stop Pot of Desires from drawing you 2 cards. What happens if multiple cards activate at once though? Say for example, you pendulum summon cards that both trigger on being summoned, like Elemental Hero Stratos and Selectrice of Almonica. Both of these cards have effects that allow you to optionally search a card from your deck on their summon. However, in this case, you really want the effect of Stratos to go through without being interrupted. So you get to choose the order of the chain since both of the triggers happened at the exact same time. And if you want to protect Stratos, you can do something that's an advanced move called chain blocking, where you simply choose to activate Stratos first, then you choose to activate Selectite right afterwards, because you get to activate both of these effects back to back before your opponent gets a chance to respond. They only have the option to negate the effect of Selectrice with the Ash Blossom in their hand if they had one, instead of being able to use it on Stratos. because most negates only work on cards that have activated last in the chain. So chain blocking is a very common strategy for high level play, and you will see this constantly. What's funny is that in Magic the Gathering, chain blocking isn't possible because you are allowed to target chains within the stack. So if this was Magic, your opponent would just be able to target Stratos' effect with an Ash Blossom, even though it was activated first and is no longer at the end of the chain. However, in Yu-Gi-Oh! It doesn't work this way, so Stratos' effect is safe to search a hero from your deck. Now let's go over priority. Priority is something that's very important when it comes to chains, because it determines how you're able to actually chain things to each other. For my past example, I kept saying you would pass your priority to your opponent in order to see if they wanted to respond. And this is basically what priority is. Who's allowed to do what during the turn. However, sometimes it's a little bit more complicated than just asking your opponent if they have a response. Like for example, if your opponent has a quick effect that can only be activated during a specific phase, they have to wait for priority in order to be able to use it. So for example, if they have something like Sprite Elf, which has a quick effect to special summon a level 2 monster from your graveyard, but only during the main phase. They can't use it as soon as your main phase starts, because you have priority to do whatever you want on your turn before your opponent gets a chance to activate quick effects. So if you wanted to try to get rid of Sprite Elf before it's able to use its effect, this is the only opportunity you have to do so. Just as long as the thing you do doesn't start a chain though, because they absolutely can just chain the effect to whatever you do. So the only surefire way to get rid of something like this without starting a chain would be use a card like a Kaiju, which can special summon to your opponent's side of the field by tributing one of your opponent's monsters and does not start a chain. So it allows you to get rid of that pesky Sprite Elf without your opponent getting an opportunity to ever use its effect, even though they made it to the main phase where it would normally be able to. There are actually a lot of other things which can pass priority to your opponent that do not involve activating an effect though. Outside of activating effects, you pass priority to your opponent if you summon a monster, set a monster from your hand, change the battle position of a monster, set any spell or traps, or try to change the phase. So if you just try to enter the battle phase without doing anything in your main phase, this will pass priority to your opponent and then they can use their effects. And this seems like kind of a complicated ruling, but it's actually done on purpose, because giving monsters a quick effect that is restricted to a phase is a nerf done specifically to lower the power level of that card, because generally this is tied to very powerful cards and effects, which would otherwise be even stronger without this restriction. Now let's go over some battle phase rules. The battle phase is split into 3 parts. There's the start step of the battle phase, which only exists because some cards and effects can only be activated here. Then there's the battle step, which is where most of the battle phase takes place. And then there's the end step, which again basically exists for card effects that only activate here. However, you're not allowed to go back to the battle step after declaring end step, so it's a little bit more restrictive. During the battle step, you're able to select any one of your monsters in attack mode in order to declare an attack with it, where you either target one of your opponent's monsters for the attack, or you can attack your opponent's life points directly, which reduces their life points by the attack of your monster, and this is the most common way you win a duel. However, if you declare an attack on one of your opponent's monsters and the monster somehow disappears for some reason, either because it's sent to the graveyard or was destroyed by some kind of card effect, as long as you haven't entered the damage step yet, you can redeclare the attack, which is called a replay. Now, there are some specific rules when it comes to a replay, because there are actually a lot of cards and effects that trigger on an attack declaration, like Mirror Force for example. So if you target a monster with an attack and for some reason didn't use Mirror Force, and that monster disappears from the field before you get a chance to go into the damage step, you get to redeclare the attack on a different monster. However, you cannot activate Mirror Force in response to this redeclare because technically they didn't declare an attack. They're performing something that's called a replay by game mechanics. Generally, this comes up pretty often with the card Link Kuriboh, which has the ability where it can tribute itself in order to lower the attack of a monster which is declared an attack, and also has a quick effect to special summon itself from the graveyard by tributing a level 1 monster. So, if you declare an attack on a level 1 monster, and your opponent responds to this by using Link Kuriboh's ability in the grave to tribute that monster, this will then cause a redeclare. And if they then target Link Kuriboh, it would not be able to use its other ability to tribute itself to lower the attack of the monster to 0, because it only triggers on a declare and not a replay. Then, if your attack successfully goes through, you enter the damage step, which is comprised of 5 different steps. First up, we have the start of the damage step. This means you are officially in the damage step, which is a distinction that actually matters, because you can't activate spell speed 2 effects during the damage step. Normally, you can activate spell speed 2 effects whenever you want, except in response to a counter trap card. However, the damage step is one of those very few exceptions. So if you want to destroy a monster that is normally kind of tricky to pin down, getting it to the damage step is one of the safest feelings you can have, because they're probably going to get destroyed because you can't really do anything at this point. However, you can still use counter trap cards during the damage step with no problem. And there's also some spell speed 2 effects that can be activated during the damage step, but it's very specific in what can and can't be used. And this basically includes all cards and effects which modify attack and defense, but they have to modify attack and defense directly. They can't modify attack and defense indirectly. So a card like Reverse Trap, for example, which has the ability to reverse the attack and defense gains of cards and effects which grant attack or defense or subtractions, can't be used during the damage step because it technically doesn't directly modify attack and defense, and instead modifies the effects of cards which modify attack and defense. Also, you can use spell speed 2 effects during the damage step which specifically negate the activation of a card, but not a card which negates the effect of a card. So to put it in simpler terms, when a card is activated, its effect is comprised into 2 different categories, the activation and the effect. If a card has the effect where it can only be activated once per turn, and a card negates the activation of the card with, say, like Solemn Judgment, then if you have another copy of that card in your hand, you can just use it because its activation was negated. But if a card negates the effect of a card and not the activation, like an Ash Blossom and Joy Spring, you would not be able to use a second copy in your hand because you technically activated the card. Its effect just kind of didn't work. So this distinction matters for the damage step, because only cards which negate the activation of cards specifically can be used here, but not cards that negate the effects of cards. So you can use Ghost Spell in Haunted Mansion because it negates the activation of cards that target cards in the graveyard, but not Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring because it only negates the effects of cards that move cards out of the deck. Now, back to the damage step. At the start of the damage step, this is basically where you activate the effects of cards that activate at the start of damage step, like Cataster, which destroys a monster that it battles which is not a dark attribute monster. And because that monster was destroyed by this effect, that immediately ends the damage step. But you cannot declare another attack because you cannot cause a redeclare during the damage step. If the attack makes it to the damage step, then it's no longer possible to cause a redeclare, which is to prevent cards like Cataster from just blowing up your opponent's entire board by crashing through everything. It is basically a limitation put in specifically for cards like Cataster, but this can also be used to your advantage. There's a card called World Legacy Clash, which allows you to banish one of your cards until the end phase and then lowers the attack and defense of one of your opponent's monsters by the attack of the monster banished. Since part of this card's effect modifies attack and defense directly, you can use it during the damage step. And on your monster that's being attacked, you can actually cause the battle to just fizzle out, and the monster it was attacking will not be allowed to redeclare, and basically it had its attack blocked for that turn. Now, after the start of the damage step, we have before damage calculation. This is basically where you flip face down monsters face up and card effects that activate before damage calculation. If a monster has a flip effect, it's not activated yet and won't apply its effect until the 4th part of the damage step. Now we go over the perform damage calculation, the 3rd part of the damage step. This is where a lot of attacking cards can be activated, like Honest or Injection Fairy Lily. Whoever is declaring the attack has priority on these moves, and there's a hidden rule that says monsters with these kinds of effects can only activate their effects once during this step, so they don't need to specify that you can only use the effects once per turn or once per damage step. So if you're attacking with Injection Fairy Lily, which allows you to pay 3,000 life points to gain 2,000 attack, you can only use it a single time because of game rules, even though it doesn't say once per turn on it. If you're attacking with a light monster and your opponent has a light monster, and you both have Honest in hand, this is where you'd be able to use them. The turn player is allowed to activate the effect first. Then your opponent is allowed to activate after. If you choose to pass priority to your opponent, you are allowed to chain the effect afterwards too. But with the attack gain of Honest, whoever attacks first is going to win that battle because the effect will resolve backwards. Honest has the ability to give attack points equal to the attack points of the monster that it's attacking. So if you use it first and then your opponent chains an Honest on top of it, it will resolve backwards, where they will gain attack equal to your monster's attack, and then you'll gain attack equal to your opponent's monster's new inflated attack and win the battle. Additionally, if you have multiple Honest in your hand and some quick play spells that modify attack and defense, you're able to use all of them at this point. But this is the last point you're able to use them. It's only permanent cards which have the restrictions where they can only use their effects once. Just to note, monsters with 0 attack cannot destroy anything by battle. So if 2 0 attack monsters battle, nothing happens. Then, once all cards and effects have activated during this step, you compare the attack and defense of your card with your opponent's card to see who won the battle and who would be sent to the grave. If you win the battle, your opponent's monster is set to be destroyed, but it's still on the field at this time. After the damage calculation, we have the 4th step, which is called After Damage Calculation. This is where you will then activate the effects of your flip monsters, as well as other effects that activate when a card is destroyed by battle or attacks, or when battle damage is inflicted, when you take damage, or effects that activate after damage calculation. So, if you have something like Dummy Golem, for example, which has the flip effect to switch control of itself with one of your opponent's monsters, if it was technically destroyed by that battle, you can't apply its effect, because even though it's still on the field, it's been determined to be set to be destroyed. So you can't do anything with it, because it basically exists in a phased out version on the field where it still is technically on the field, but you can't technically resolve its effect because it's not an undestroyed card on the field. And finally, we go to the 5th step of damage calculation, which is called the end of the damage step. If a monster is set to be destroyed, this is where you will finally send it to the graveyard. So since this is the phase of the damage step where you activate the effects of cards that activate when they're destroyed, technically a lot of floating effects, which is a fan term for effects that happen when a card is destroyed, will activate here during the damage step, which means a lot of other effects will not apply. If a Sandgan is destroyed, for example, it will activate its search effect here and can't be negated by Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, because they can't activate the effect of a card which negates an effect during the damage step. And we are still technically in the damage step at this point. This is also where you activate the effects of cards which trigger when you destroy a monster by battle and send it to the graveyard, like Fire Dog. Then after the end of the damage step, you go back to the battle step, which is basically the entirety of the battle phase. And you can choose more attacks or choose to end the battle phase. Next, let's go over zone placement. Because zone placement matters a lot for Link monsters, there is actually the perfect zone to summon your boss monster to if you want to make sure it's protected. And that is always your rightmost zone. Now, let me explain. There is a card called Geonator Transverser, which can swap the positions of monsters that it's diagonal to. So, if it's in the extra monster zone, it targets your middle and leftmost main monster zone, which means you want to avoid these zones so that your monster is not stolen. There is also a card called Relinquished Anima, which is able to absorb the monster directly in front of it, which also means the zones directly below the extra monster zones are unsafe, because Relinquished Anima is able to get the monster that's directly in those two zones. And also, the extra monster zone is unsafe because there's actually a lot of cards that only specifically target monsters in the extra monster zone, which means the only safe zone that exists on the board is the rightmost zone. However, most people don't play Geonator Transverser, so you can kind of safely put monsters in the leftmost and middlemost zone as well, but they are technically not as safe as your rightmost zone. Now let's go over some Yu-Gi-Oh keywords. Technically, Yu-Gi-Oh doesn't really have keywords, except that it does. The first we have is Destroy. Destroy is a keyword which indicates a monster is about to be sent to the graveyard. A card can be destroyed on the field, in your hand, and even in your deck. And if it's destroyed, it always goes to the graveyard, unless there's some kind of floodgate which banishes it instead. The reason this matters is because there are a lot of cards which activate when they are destroyed specifically. So if a card is destroyed in your deck and sent to the graveyard, it will trigger. But if it's sent from your deck to the graveyard, it will not, because it wasn't destroyed, it was sent. This distinction is why Zeus is a very powerful board breaker, because it sends all cards on the field to the graveyard, and it doesn't technically destroy them. So it gets by a lot of protection effects which prevent destruction, and also around a lot of floating effects which only activate on destruction. Next up we have Banished or Banishment. This is just what happens when you remove a card from play. it goes into the Banish zone, which until recently wasn't called a zone and was just always called banishment. Cards can only go to the Banish zone as part of a card effect or a restriction. They do not go there on their own through normal gameplay. Excavate is another keyword, which literally is just an easy way to say, look at the top cards of your deck until you find one that is specified as part of the effect. So instead of saying, look at the top 3 cards of your deck and then put out a warrior, you could say, excavate the top 3 cards of your deck until you find a warrior and then add it to your hand. Piercing is another keyword, which basically means trample for MTG people, where if a monster attacks a defense position monster, you can inflict battle damage to your opponent's life points equal to the difference in your attack and that monster's defense, where normally they would take no damage. Negate is another keyword, which basically means it stops the effect of a card from happening. This matters because there are some cards which activate when a card is negated specifically, but won't activate if the effect is just stopped in some other way. And finally, there's targeting. This just means you're selecting a card in order to resolve some kind of effect. And while that's basically it when it comes to common keywords, there are some more, but we don't really need to go over all of them. I would like to go over targeting a little bit more, but before that, we have to go into colons and semicolons. When a card is activated, you have to meet the conditions of that card before the colon. Otherwise, you're not able to activate the card at all. Once you meet the conditions for the card activation, then you have to pay the cost, which happens after the colon, but before the semicolon. Then this is where you wait for responses. If your opponent has no response, then you're able to resolve the chain and actually apply the effect, which happens after the colon or semicolon, because not all cards have both colons and semicolons. So colons are for conditions that need to be met before the card can be activated. Semicolons are for paying the cost and selecting targets. But targeting is not a cost. It's just done at the same time as paying cost. And then you wait before other cards and effects can be activated in response. And then you'll activate the effect once it's appropriate in the chain. So, if a card does not have a colon or semicolon, then it doesn't start a chain and can be used immediately, which is usually only there for monsters that have a summoning condition like Cyber Dragon. There is an exception with basically all spells and traps, because a lot of them have the condition of just being used from the hand, so they don't state that in the card itself. So there's no need for a lot of them to have colons and semicolons, and they can just detail pure effect, because activating the card is basically its colon. Now we can go into targeting and non-targeting. So when you target a card, this happens before the semicolon, and because you have to target before the effect resolves, it is possible to counter a player card which is about to be targeted for something by like temporarily removing it from the field, for example, or temporarily giving it some kind of protection. Like, for example, if a card targets a face down card and then the card destroys that face down target, then if the card is no longer a face down card, it is no longer a correct target, so it won't get destroyed. However, this was more of a relic of the old cards. Modern cards get around this by just saying destroy it instead of saying destroy that target. So, if you target a face down card and then it's flipped face up, but the effect says destroy it instead of destroy that target, the card will still be destroyed because it actually didn't go anywhere, it just changed its state. Also, if a card doesn't designate a target before the semicolon, then it doesn't target. Like for example, Destiny Hero Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer can destroy one card you control and another card on the field. But this happens after the colon and it doesn't have a semicolon, so it doesn't target. And the cards chosen to be destroyed happen as soon as they are selected when resolving the effect. There's another type of ruling you should be aware of when versus if, where if a card has an optional when effect, then it has a chance to miss timing. For example, a card like Dupe Frog. It has an optional effect that when it's sent from the field to the graveyard, you can add a frog monster from your deck or graveyard to your hand. But if you tribute the card in order to bring out something else, then the effect won't trigger, because when effects have to be the last thing that happens. And summoning another monster was the last thing that happened technically with that tribute summon example. But if a card simply says if instead of when, then you can just ignore all of this because it will trigger whenever it can instead of immediately. Why is there a difference between when and if? Well, when effects are generally given to negates, because they can only be responded to immediately after the effect you want to negate. And if they had an if effect, then it wouldn't really make sense with how chains work in Yu-Gi-Oh! Also, it's a way to intentionally nerf some cards, like all of the Paleozoic trap monsters have the effect where, when a trap card is activated, you can special summon it from the graveyard. But if your opponent simply chain blocks your activation of trap cards, they can stop the Paleozoic monster from coming out. A lot of modern cards don't really have win optional floating effects like Dupe Frog anymore, so you don't have to worry about this ruling too much unless you're playing an older format like Edison. Also, if a win effect is mandatory, as in it doesn't allow you to choose to activate it or not, then it also does not miss timing, just like if it was an if effect. So just think of win and if effects like keywords, and just memorize that win can miss timing and if does not. And to cap off this video, let's go over rules versus card effects. Basically, card effects take precedent over the rules, and it's an official rule that says if a card effect says it can do something that is not part of the base rules, then the card effect can do it anyway. Like for example, a monster can only attack once, but it can have a card effect which allows it to attack twice. Just remember, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a very complicated game, and there's even more rules I didn't go over, like the mechanics of trap monsters and tokens, but this covers all of the basics.